everybody. I'm Lauren LeClaire. This is Amanda May-Bomar and Valerie Grabski. We want to thank all of you for giving us part of your meeting to share our findings with you and for giving us such an interesting topic to research. That was the perfect introduction to VTS and to the school tours that we looked at in our study. You can go to the next one. So I'll start, for most of you who haven't been with us along the way, with our evaluation question. Our question is, under what conditions are high levels of participation observed in VTS-based tours at the Frye Art Museum? So there are a lot of different terms to break down within this question we found, and so I'll break them down. For conditions, we mean many different things, and we observed and recorded many different things, including group size, questions asked by the gallery guide, whether or not an activity took place during the stop on the tour, whether or not the tour happened before or after art making. So things like this are what we mean by conditions, and you can also think of them kind of as inputs, so we're looking at inputs and outcomes. High levels just means relative to the levels that we observed, so there's no standard measure that we consider to be high levels. It was just in terms of our own observations. Participation are the behavioral outcomes that you can think of on the other side of the inputs. We observed behaviors from the more basic, like raising your hand or listing, to the more complex, like revising your own opinion or disagreeing or using conditional language, which is another term that I'll explain a little bit later on. And then VTS-based just refers to the fact that the VTS tours at the Frye aren't necessarily strict VTS without anything else. They're blended with the Frye's gallery guide's own methods and techniques to increase participation and increase learning and engagement. So since we looked at tours here specifically, we're not evaluating VTS, we're evaluating the actual program that exists at the Frye. This is just a basic overview of our methods. For students, our student audience, we did observations, so there were 1 to 4 of us in the galleries at any given time during a tour, and we were watching one student as they progressed through the different stops on the tour. And I'll show you our observation instrument sheet on the next slide. And then for our guide audience, we also did post-tour debrief surveys with the guides. So we asked them, we kind of noticed that there was a natural debrief that was happening at the end of the tours, and so we wanted to get in and see what the guides were thinking of about how the tour that they just finished giving went compared to the other tours that they'd given, and then kind of compare that to what we actually observed. So this is our observation instrument, and a great way to think about, this is a great visualization tool for the inputs and the outcomes. So up here on the top we have conditions that are outside of the gallery guide's control. They're the date, how long the stop lasted, whether the tour was before or after the art making session, so the first or second stop. And then the things on the left are the gallery guide's questions and additional information and activities that they used. And the things on the right are the behaviors that we observed the student doing while they were on the stop. So each observation instrument is one stop on the tour. That's an important thing to think about.
So you want to talk about the groups in the bottom right?
Yeah, and then so another thing is participation in our study is broken down both in terms of depth and breadth. So when we talk about depth of participation, we're talking about going from the more simple behaviors to the more complex behaviors on an individual student level. And then when we talk about breadth of participation, we're talking about just any verbal participation on the part of any member of the group. So basically what we're watching for, this is why we have little symbols for each of the students, what we're watching for when we're marking these is just how many students speak during a stop on the tour and how often each of them speak. So that's how we kept track of the breadth of participation, and then this is how we kept track of the depth. Our sample size, as it actually turned out, was 68 students, which totaled a number of 276 observations. So it's 276 stops and 68 students complete tours. 21 days total observed, 11 gallery guides were observed, and 23 different artworks that were visited on the tours were observed by us. So I'll break down some terms before we get into our findings. Frequency of VTS is something that we measured a lot of the different outcomes against. So when we say frequency of VTS, we mean the use of the 3 questions that you heard in the video. What's going on in this picture? What do you see that makes you say that? And what more can you find, or what more can we find? But we also mean the different questions that the Frye Gallery Guides use that are related to these questions. So we basically coded for questions that essentially were getting at these same intentions that these questions have. And then student outcome is the average sum of the following behaviors. So we broke the different behavioral outcomes into 3 types of behaviors. Raising hand and listing was considered type A behavior. Agreeing, disagreeing, speculative listing, type B. Providing evidence, building on dialogue, and revising one's own opinion was type C behaviors. And they're not measured against each other at all. It's basically just to see how the different kinds of behavior were changing depending on the different inputs. So,
Very well said.
yeah, and then our main findings, to just kind of put them out there first before we really get into them, is that VTS use, as I just described it, has a significant positive relationship with desired student outcomes. Group size was a major determinant of outcomes. We'll talk about that. It's kind of a thing that you might think of as obvious, but as groups got bigger, participation went down. Use of additional activities had a measurable impact on the entire group participation rates and on student deep participation on the individual level. So the additional activities that the gallery guides at the Frye use specifically increased student participation measurably. And then student outcomes were more frequent in the first group in the galleries. So we saw slightly higher levels of participation for the group that was doing the tour before they went and did art making. And then some artworks resulted in desired outcomes happening more frequently, but it was interesting because they resulted in changes between the different types of behavior, not necessarily a total overall increase, but just a change in the way that behavior looked, or that participation looked, rather. So we'll look at the graphs that explain all of these findings.
Excellent. So these are those first findings. This graph here talks about that input of the frequency use of VTS questions, and it's measured against the mean outcomes of student behaviors, separated by type, like Lauren said, A being kind of on the earlier stages of these types of behaviors, and C being a little bit more in depth. So you can see that when the gallery guides use the questions around 4 to 7 times, they had the best outcomes for student behaviors, the highest results. So there's definitely a sweet spot, not too little, not too much, for asking those questions. This one shows the use of conditional language by the gallery guides against the outcome of students using conditional language in their responses. And you see that, as the guide uses it, that there's a measured increase in student use. And that would be when they're talking about using the words like this might be, that may be, perhaps it is a. So there's definitely a relationship between both the questions and the conditional language. Oh, group size. So as Lauren mentioned, that's a major finding too. You definitely see a lot of the desired outcomes as group sizes are around 4 through about 6, and then there's a dramatic drop off in the results of the behaviors of the students. So you can't always control that, but if you can keep groups smaller and not have them sometimes come together and meet up, sometimes guides would bring them together at an art piece at the end of the tour, and it resulted in less desirable outcomes. So maybe keeping them individual and separate, as small as possible. Right around 6 is ideal for group size.
And then looking at the additional activities, these are the activities that the gallery guides would incorporate into the tour. And so they would have the students at different works of art either pose like an animal in the art, or they would have them build a story based on what was happening in the picture. And these were really designed to get all the kids participating, either physically or verbally, in a way that wasn't always possible when you're having the students raise their hands. So this is like, I'm going to start a story, you're going to go, you're going to go, you're going to go. And so it really encouraged entire group participation. And what we noticed is that when you had the additional activities at the stops by the artwork, that you saw a very measurable increase, in group participation when there were activities at this stop. And as Lauren had said, that we also noticed that when activities were present at a stop, you did have a increased use of the type C behaviors. So these would be the revising your own opinion and building a dialogue, which was very exciting to see. And so the additional activities at the stops really brought all the students into participating, as well as deepened the conversations taking place. And then looking at in what order the tours happened, the students would be broken in the class would be broken in half. One half would be up in the art studio making art, and the other half would be doing the gallery tours. And we noticed that the students that did the gallery tours first were more engaged in conversation. And we're not too sure why this is, but it's something the gallery guides would frequently mention, is that the second group really has a lot more trouble concentrating. It's getting close to lunchtime. I think that might be it. The second group's less engaged, or they're more rowdy. And we don't know why this is. We doubt it has anything to do with art. We think it might be closer to the fact that this is the 11 to noon tour, but we don't know. And then looking at the works of art, we weren't grading the works of art, but we were really noting that they sort of encouraged different types of conversation. These are looking at some of the most frequently used pieces in the founding collection. We don't have the visiting pieces listed over here. They occurred less frequently, and we didn't have as strong of a data set for that. But we noticed that the gallery guides would be changing what they're doing based on the piece and based on what ways they found most appropriate to encourage dialogue at a piece of art. They'd approach video installations differently than they would approach a painting, because when you put first graders in front of a video installation, they go into television watching mode. And so, yeah, this is really looking at what the gallery guides were doing differently at each piece. And we noticed that, for example, the Morning on the Hill Slack Day, you had a lot more listing behaviors, as well as you had more students agreeing and disagreeing and sort of dissecting what was happening in the piece based on, wait, what type of animals are these? I think these are animals or sheep. No, I think you're wrong, they're mountain goats. And we noticed that more with that piece, whereas in The Coming Storm, West Norway, the students were really talking about what's happening in the piece and trying to break down what's the relationship between the people in the boat and what's happening in the boat, and how these students, all these characters and places are relating. So you had very different conversations happening at each piece. And we noticed also that different pieces had different amounts of conversation taking place between the students. Different pieces had more students participating. But we think this might also be linked to which pieces of art the gallery guides most frequently used activities with. So for the Norwegian girl, they often asked the students to, one by one, tell what animal they wanted to put in the picture. And so each student was then asked, so what animal do you want to put in here? And they would go student by student. And we believe that's what's being reflected in the fact that there are the different participation levels in the group.
Yeah, so this graph's showing the average percent of student participation at each of those stops.
Yeah.
So, on average. Okay. I was gonna wrap up. So yeah, we're just going over our main findings again. We found that the use of or the frequency of use of VTS methods resulted in, or was significantly correlated with the desired student behaviors. Guides using VTS questions 4 to 8 times per artwork had the highest student behavior levels. And if you remember that graph, it does, as Amanda was saying, kind of look like a curve, and that's obviously related to time and not just necessarily overuse of questions. It's a combination. So once questions are going on past 8 at a stop, the participation kind of drops. And then students in groups of 5 to 6 resulted in the highest student outcomes. Activities were correlated with increased participation in type C student behaviors. This is my favorite finding of all of our findings because it's specific to the Frye, the way that the activities happen on the stops, and it measurably increased participation in use alongside VTS. So we didn't have a control group, but I'm interested in what it would look like if there was a control with just strict VTS usage, and then a group that was doing it the way that the Frye does it with activities, and how participation would look depending on that, because I would guess that it would be higher with activities. And then the second group phenomenon, we think also related to kids having shorter attention spans. Everybody gets tired and can't really talk and participate when it gets closer to lunchtime. And then the type of artwork might play a role in participation. Again, we weren't grading that artwork at all. We're just interested in how different types of artwork and different mediums or media might inspire different kinds of environments for participation and different kinds of behaviors to happen more often. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks so
Great.
much.